yours. Segment 2.
Okay. Ozzy Osbourne's Blizzard of Oz from 1980. In the opening montage, you heard Crazy Train, and now you're going to hear the other single, Mr. Crowley. All right, Matt, I bet this is higher than Pylon.
It sure is. This is Blizzard of Oz comes in at number 172 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums, number 26 in 1980, number 1089 of all time. It's Ozzy's highest rated album on Best Ever Albums, and it did not make Rolling Stone's list.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yep. So this has got to be either John or 1001.
This is 1001, but this also would have been a John's pick for sure.
Yeah.
So,
So I'm not going to give the whole bio of Ozzy Osbourne from his childhood. I mean, we covered Black Sabbath. A lot of my bio is kind of overlapping with that because this is, his first solo effort, and I feel like you can't tell the story of Ozzy Osbourne without including some Black Sabbath background. So that's kind of where we start. We last talked about Ozzy Osbourne in the context of Black Sabbath with Master of Reality from 1971. So it's been almost 10 years from when this album was released that the career progressed and continued. And as you know, also dedicated listeners, Matt and I covered the 1980 Black Sabbath album, Heaven and Hell, for a bonus episode. So we can compare and contrast there as well.
I did listen to it as well, so I can throw in my 2 cents. Yes. Mm-hmm.
This is Ozzy's first solo album, as I said, after being fired from Black Sabbath in 1979. And so what happened in between all those years? Well, a lot of drugs, for one thing. To start, Black Sabbath released 5 more albums in the 70s. Substance abuse and fatigue from touring was prevalent throughout all of this. I'm going to kind of jump around, but 1973's Sabbath Bloody Sabbath was the band's 5th platinum album to date, and in June of 76 they began to work on their album Technical Ecstasy. They added a keyboard player to expand their sound, and during this time Ozzy admits to beginning to lose interest in the band and considers working with other musicians. In late 77, while rehearsing for their next album, Never Say Die, with an exclamation point, Ozzy quits the band unexpectedly, and he left basically for 3 months to pursue solo work and what became Blizzard of Oz. He called, even from back then, he was calling it Blizzard of Oz. He ended up changing his mind. I can't tell if the band wanted him back or he wanted back based on what I read, but he rejoined Black Sabbath, and he came back 3 days before they were set to go into the studio. And also, unfortunately, he refused to sing any of the songs that the band had written, with his replacement Dave Walker filling in, so they had no songs to record, and they spent 5 months writing and recording what would become Never Say Die. But the band admitted that it was a horrible experience and that drugs interfered a lot, and they basically would be so high that they couldn't play and had no ideas, and then they would just end up saying, oh, we'll do it tomorrow, and then that cycle repeated where they would not be very productive for long stretches of time. Unsurprisingly, that album did poorly, commercially and critically. The drugs, this is a band where the drugs, admitted by the band members themselves, the drugs really kind of got out of control and affected them, unlike some other bands seem to handle it better than others. But in comparison, so they went on tour in 1978 with a little band called Van Halen opening for them, and who was touring for the first time, and critics found their Black Sabbath's performance tired and uninspired, quote, especially compared to Van Halen for them. So as you can see, I can imagine Van Halen had a lot of energy to bring to their tour.
That still had to be a cool show to be at, right? Like, I saw Van Halen and Black Sabbath together.
Yeah. Drug and alcohol use continued as they worked on their next album, but Tony Iommi said that Osbourne was abusing on a whole different level. The band's unhappiness, their rampant drug use, and pressure from the label forced Tony to make the decision to fire Ozzy Osbourne. The drummer Bill Ward was chosen to tell Osbourne on April 27, 1979, And about firing Ozzy, he said, quote, "I hope I was professional. I might not have been, actually. When I'm drunk, I'm horrible. I am horrid." Ward also said, quote, "Alcohol was definitely one of the most damaging things to Black Sabbath. We were destined to destroy each other. The band was very, very toxic." Ozzy was out. After leaving Sabbath, Ozzy was paid £96,000 for his kind of rights to the name Black Sabbath, or for his share of the name. And he said that he was going to spend 3 months doing coke and booze, with the idea being that he would end up back in Birmingham on unemployment. And however,
that was his goal.
Yeah, basically just kind of go out in a blaze of, or a fizzle really, but just spend all that money on drugs. And however, Don Arden, who was managing Black Sabbath at the time, signed him to Jet Records with the idea of Ozzy recording new material. He sent his daughter Sharon Arden to go look after Ozzy in LA, which I feel like is a shitty job. I would kind of be mad about that, but I guess she ended up marrying him. So
I was about to say, she ended up not only embracing the job but marrying him. So.
Yeah, and being his manager later on too. So he sent her to kind of protect his investment and possibly get him. There was an early idea with him maybe rejoining Black Sabbath again or forming his own band, which he ended up doing. And in late '79, Ozzy formed Blizzard of Oz as a band. So that was kind of the name of the band, actually, to start, with the drummer Lee Kerslake of Uriah Heep, bassist Bob Daisley of Rainbow and later Uriah Heep, keyboardist Don Airy of Uriah Heep, so a lot of Uriah Heep, a band we haven't really talked about, and later he was later of Deep Purple, and guitarist Randy Rhoads of Quiet Riot. So those were the members of Blizzard of Oz.
Quiet Riot was around before this?
I guess so. The record label ended up calling the album Blizzard of Oz and credited Ozzy Osbourne, basically starting his solo career. So the band wasn't really happy with how this played out. They expected it to be credited, as well, and not put Ozzy kind of front and center. But then the album came out and Ozzy Osbourne was in bigger font than the Blizzard of Oz, and so then it kind of just came de facto Ozzy Osbourne as the name of the band, as a solo project. Keep in mind, all during this time, it's not like Ozzy Osbourne had cleaned up and gone sober. He's still continuing to do drugs. Based on what I read, it seems like he really had minimal creative input into this album, with the lion's share of the songwriting and music to the other credited to the other members of the band. Randy Rhoads felt that he and Daisley were contributing the vast majority of the songwriting and arranging, and had little interest in performing in a backing band for someone he felt wasn't contributing as much. The album producer Max Norman also said that Kerslake and Daisley made significant songwriting contributions during recording. It had been reported that Sharon Osbourne later, Sharon Levy at the time, later Osbourne, was not happy with the level of creative input the other band members had and did not want them to share credit. However, this is contradicted by the fact that she wasn't even there during recording, and Ozzy was still married to his former wife at the time, and Sharon was in LA and not involved with the band yet. So she's kind of inserting herself, probably retrospectively as well. The album was released on September 20th, 1980 in the UK and March 21st, 1981 in the US. Randy Rhoads, Bob Daisley, and Ozzy are all credited as co-writers. And actually, it was written without a permanent drummer at the time. Lee Kerslake was kind of hired during the recording process. He was given 6 days to learn the songs, and then they went back into the studio to record. All of the songs were actually written before Kerslake joined the band, except No Bone Movies. Chris Sangarides was hired to produce the album along with Max Norman as the sound engineer, but then the band was unhappy with Chris Sangarides and they fired him, and Norman finished the album and later went on to produce other solo Ozzy Osbourne albums. The Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley were released as the singles. And then there is some controversy in this album due to the song Suicide Solution. After the October 1984 suicide of a teenager, John McCullum, his parents claimed that the song, that Suicide Solution was the song he listened to right before he killed himself, and they sued Osbourne and CBS Records. Ozzy said that he was thinking of the death of Bon Scott when the song was being written, and Bob Daisley, who was credited with most of the lyrics, said he was thinking of Ozzy's own substance abuse issues when writing it. Despite all that, the case was dismissed on First Amendment grounds protecting free speech, and that he has the freedom to express himself through song like that. This album was very successful commercially, and by 2019, it's become 5 times platinum. Blizzard of Oz is one of the few albums among the top 100 bestsellers of the 80s to become platinum without a top 40 hit, according to the Recording Industry Association of America. So kind of what I saw, Crazy Train, even though Crazy Train was released as a single, it didn't really get much play compared to how it has become kind of, associated with Ozzy Osbourne, and I feel like it's much more play nowadays. So that's kind of what they're saying. And I didn't really do any post bio. There is some crazy stuff that happens. Primarily that Randy Rhoads was killed in kind of this freak accident during the recording of their second album. The tour bus driver was flying a plane with Randy Rhoads and the costume/makeup designer, and he thought it would be funny to kind of low fly the tour bus that they were following, and he clipped the tree or clipped the bus or something and crashed into a mansion that was nearby and killed himself and Randy Rhoads and the woman that was there. So that was crazy. But despite all that, Ozzy Osbourne's still alive, and so he's one of those rare ones that can do a lot of drugs and still, like Keith Richards and others, come out okay. So I know, John, you said that this was an album you were familiar with. So what did you think this time around listening to it?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, I've probably listened to this album 50 times in my life. I mean, it's when I was getting into metal, and you talk, I like the classic metal story, right? The metal punk story. I had siblings of guys I knew, right, who were older than me, in some cases like 8 or 9 years older than me. So as I'm stumbling into metal in the late 80s, early 90s, I've always had an interest in looking backwards, the influences and stuff like that. And sure. I kind of said, what are the albums you listen to? And they direct you to Black Sabbath and stuff like that, but then they get the stuff that they listen to. They say, this is what I listened to when I was your age, right? And they gave me Blizzard of Oz was one of those albums. And so I've heard it so many times. I will say this. This album is of the early 80s, for sure. And even though Crazy Train has become ageless, I guess, because of it becoming a stadium rock song, which if you had told me at 10 years old that Crazy Train would be like a stadium rock song with
or
what
baseball
Ozzy,
game
right, with like what Ozzy and metal's take was at that, Ozzy was as much known when I was like a young kid for like supposedly being a Satanist as he was, as Ozzy. And then, the Osbournes happened and time goes on, and the people you listen to as a kid, they become adults, and suddenly Ozzy's mainstream, right? That's kind of just how it works. But so I always found this to be a very interesting album because you've got, big guitar riffs all over this. I mean, this is as much a Randy Rhoads album as it is an Ozzy album. Let's be honest.
Yes.
I mean, it's just the I know that they had a very tumultuous relationship, the two of them. I think largely because Randy Rhoads, I think, just wanted to play and become more technically proficient, and Ozzy, during this period was basically just constantly drunk, right, and barely able to take the stage. And I know that the band and Sharon didn't get along, right, because she was sort of taking control of Ozzy's life, which it's like the classic thing of, you marry someone who you need, and it's a good relationship for you, but that person doesn't necessarily bond with everybody else you know. So it's like it's the right relationship for you, but it's also your friends have a point about that person as well. So I always felt like that was a little bit of what was going on. But I always thought the shift from Crazy Train to Goodbye to Romance was interesting because Goodbye to Romance is like an 80s ballad kind of. And then D is, God, is it 45 seconds maybe? And in totality is directly after that.
50
and
seconds.
Suicide Solution is this grinding, as close as Ozzy gets. It's like more of like it's a metal sound for sure, but it's got kind of a punk rock ethos a little bit, like a nihilistic streak. And then of course Mr. Crowley goes back into full dark arts, Aleister Crowley, and
Halloween.
It's just one of the most enjoyable songs to sing and listen to this day. I love that song. And then the album kind of, I always felt the album kind of tails off a little bit at the end. I like the songs, but they're kind of just there in my opinion. I've always loved the guitar on this album, but I wouldn't say it's a transcendent album for me. It's a guitar album for me. Don't get me wrong, I love Ozzy's voice. And there is some cool keyboard work, for example, in Mr. Crowley, but to me, this album is sort of marveling at Randy Rhoads' guitar. Outside of Eddie Van Halen, I think he's the most distinctive guitarist of the late 70s and the early 80s, in my opinion. Like when I think of the guitar sound of that era, right, and who did it best, I kind of think Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads were the two that I would pick in terms of guitar, because it's not just the guitar sound, it's his tone and his guitar and his choices he makes for his solos. He goes from sort of rapid fire tapping to like almost classical type of guitar parts. I really, his artistic choices are always very interesting to me on guitar. But yeah, I mean, what can you say about Blizzard of Oz? It's, if you in any way fashion yourself as any sort of metalhead, you kind of need to listen to this for the prototype of the guitar you're going to be listening to. I mean, certainly if you're a hair metal fan, I mean, this is kind of like hair metal guitar done at a level way, way ahead of any type of guitar work later in the decade for hair metal. I mean, and you know, lyrically, it's still about the dark arts and about sort of Ozzy's struggles, I would say. Would you say? I agree, but then there's always that weird thing of like Ozzy loving the Beatles, and so he always has like elements of melody in his songs because I think his great love is the Beatles, right, which he says all the time. And so there's always a feel that, you know, Ozzy's doing in his own way. Ozzy's trying to make his own White Album. It just sounds a lot different. So
I mean, Goodbye to Romance does sound a little reminiscent of the Beatles at times.
I always think it does. It sounds like Across the Universe a little bit. I've always thought, doesn't it? When you think about it, that's kind of why, and I always look at that as like Ozzy trying to write a Beatles song, in my opinion. But yeah, so definitely a thumbs up. I wouldn't say this is an album that I like love, but there's certain songs. I mean, certainly Mr. Crowley and Suicide Solution and Crazy Train and I Don't Know are songs that if you put them on, I will always listen to them from start to finish because they're awesome songs. I Don't Know, I think, has a really interesting chord. It's like Ozzy in the wilderness, sort of. Like he's just going to say, I don't know. Like at the end, it's like, I know you don't, Ozzy. You truly believe him when he says it. So, or, you know, it's kind of like, I don't know. It's like, it's that, I don't know what it is. That like Randy Rhoads guitar part perfectly melds with like Ozzy's like voice, you know, that sort of shrill voice. It's like the guitar part always scores it perfectly, and I think I Don't Know is the best example of those two sounds fusing. So yeah, definite thumbs up on this one, but I wouldn't call it like the top tier of metal or hard rock either.
Yeah, I liked it as well. I think I hear what you're saying. It definitely it's interesting because the guitar, I like the guitar sound, but it's also like this big. It's supposed to be this big, bombastic, like metal hard rock guitar sound, but yet it's also like the production kind of almost puts it in the background. You know, it's not a full sound. And I don't know if that was an intentional thing, if that was just something that was happening in the '80s, but it definitely seems like it's, you know, it could have opened it up more, I think, and to have it a bigger guitar sound. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. I agree. I like the first part of this better. I definitely think it tails off after Mr. Crowley, which is that's a great song too. And I love on that song the harmonic dual guitar part, which should happen more in music like that. It doesn't have to be just a metal thing. Like when I think Iron Maiden does that a lot too. But like there's so many great like vocal harmonies in music. If you have why not do that with the guitar as well? I just love that part when they're playing the two guitar parts against each other. And it's also got a kind of a creepy opening part. That synth opening part is this eerie part, and it's that's a great song too. Crazy Train's got. I mean, we just did Judas Priest a couple weeks ago, Breaking the Law, like top guitar riff, like Crazy Trains, like that opening guitar riff is very iconic. It's not one of my favorites, but like it's definitely it's great. And you're right, Josh. That's something they'll play at a baseball game, or they'll play like it's become more of a universal song. It's not just owned by the metalheads. It's kind of like it's a popular song, for a lot the people. Don't
forget the Little John version.
The Little John version, right? That's right. Yes. I thought too it was an interesting. Like you start off with "I Don't Know," which is a song I didn't know any of the other songs. I just knew "Crazy Train" and Mr. Crowley. So I liked "I Don't Know" a lot. I thought that was a good opening track. And then I thought that the "Goodbye to Romance" transition was weird. It just seemed like out of place. But the more I listened to it, the more I liked it. I do like the guitar solo in that. And at the beginning, I think I'm not a huge fan of, but the way that song transitions and builds a little bit, I do like. D is fine. It seems, I don't know, it's one of those useless songs. It's cool what Rhodes is doing, but it's like, did you need that? I don't know. And I think, and Suicide Solution I liked. I don't love that. It's fine. It's got a decent riff. No Bone Movies was an interesting song. The more I listened to that, the more I thought this sounds like a kind of like a Boston song. Like it's got like it's not so much metal as it is more of the AOR type sound. I mean, it's got more edge than Boston does, but if you listen to just the guitar part and like the way it's playing, it's more of that kind of falling in the lane of like the classic rock, AOR Boston type song. So
it's kind of more upbeat in some way. I feel like
it's not as interesting. It's and I'm not slighting Boston at all. It didn't. It kind of fell flat a little bit for me. And then Revelation Mother Earth seems the most superfluous song. I mean, that's like a prog song. And this is like the example of like Randy Rhoads showcasing the guitar to the nth degree, and it's like it's too much. It's great, but at the same time it's like, man, I don't need that much guitar tricks happening. It's not like I hate it or anything like that, or I want to turn it off. It's amazing what he's doing, but sometimes I do find with metal that when the guitarist gets like really carried away with stuff, it's just, I don't know, it's flashy, it's impressive, but like as far as like my enjoyment of the song goes, I wouldn't say that it enhances it. Maybe that would be different if I saw it live and I just saw somebody like absolutely shredding. That would be a different experience, but just on a listening experience, it kind of goes a bit much. It reminded me of that what's that song at the end of Rock Band? That's just like ridiculous, Dragon Force or whatever. That's just like ridiculously over the top. It's got parts like that, only not nearly as long as what that song would be. I do like the way it ends. Steal Away the Night, I think is a I think they bring it back a little bit there. That's a fun, fast-paced, good song. So overall, I liked it. I would just say that maybe the tracks 7 and 8, No Bone Movies and Revelation, are the ones that left me a little flat. So thumbs up. It's not my favorite. I think I like some of the other metal albums that we've covered more than this, but it's still good. And I agree. Ozzy's voice is classic. It's still it's not that soaring vocal, that soaring metal vocal that you get with Dio. And we talked about the difference between him and Ozzy before, but Ozzy's he's got that. It's not a great voice, but it's a distinct voice, and it fits well within the genre. So yeah, I'm thumbs up on it. I did like this record.
Yeah, I like this record too. I think the highs are pretty high on it, and overall, it's a pretty solid album. There is some stuff here that it's kind of constructed weird as an album, and there's not really a clear through line or idea of what they want to do, like with the idea of Goodbye to Romance and Deep kind of being in the sort of middle of the album, and Revelation I feel like is almost like a little rock opera shoved in to the album as well. Yeah, it's very classical and I don't know, Baroque or something. But when you have songs like Crazy Train and Suicide Solution and Mr. Crowley, they're really good, and I love the guitar on this. Obviously, I love the blistering guitar solos on many of the songs, like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley. It just sounds kind of so singular in some ways. I think John did a good job of saying how much Randy Rhoads contributed, and that's kind of the impression I got doing the research too, is credit goes to these other artists in the band. This is, Ozzy is lending his voice to stuff that they created. This is my interpretation. They take their time sometimes. They're not afraid to slow down, like on the opening track, I Don't Know. It's kind of slows down midway and has kind of that prog feel, or some of that early metal where they kind of transition into another, a way to give you a breather before going back into it. I heard a lot of like tinges of like the hair metal that John mentioned, like Suicide Solution. Some of that reminded me of Guns N' Roses. Like, I don't know, Slash I feel like must have heard this and took something from it when playing the guitar or something. The No Bone Movies, like you said, Matt, it kind of reminded me of like later 80s metal. Something about it sounded more like stadium rockish, and I think Steal the Way of the Night is a nice, fun like closer that just kind of hammers the guitars again, and you're not reinventing the wheel here, but I feel like it's really fun ride to go on with a lot of these songs. And as much as I've heard Crazy Train, it's still fucking awesome when you hear it like in the context of the album. It's kind of like I forgot how good it was actually. So yeah, I really like this album. I thought it was fun. It's interesting to compare this to the Dio-led Black Sabbath Heaven and Hell, because it does sound really different. And it does, I don't know, how much Ozzy contributed to this, but there is definitely like a different artistic interpretation of what metal is at this time period. And it's like Black Sabbath is like rising, and Blizzard of Oz is like falling in terms of sound in some way, or slowing it down, or going in some different direction. So I feel like it's very interesting to compare and contrast those two albums. But yeah, I is it one of my favorite metal albums that we've covered so far? I don't know. Of the 80s, maybe. We haven't gotten Iron Maiden yet, which is probably going to win. But yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed listening to it.
Yeah, part of the mythology of this one always for me is how crazy Randy Rhoads' death is. There's few stories that are more odd than that one. I mean, like,
yes.
I mean, it's almost like incomprehensible. Like
he was only 25.
Yeah, I mean, there's a random tour guide who'd been up the previous night doing coke and stuff, and may or may not have been trying to kill his ex-wife, in a plane, like while doing stuff, buzzing the tour bus, and then just you can't even fathom this. It's like, how could a guy just take a plane up, over and over and over again and do this, and people voluntarily get in with it? It was insane. So I guess it's just that thing in rock, where there's an invincibility, but I mean, what a tragedy, because I can only imagine the type of work he would have been doing throughout the 80s and 90s, guitar-wise. So, I mean, that colors to me a lot of early Ozzy, because it's so coupled, and then he's gone, and Ozzy always brings in great session players, always, but it's different, because that would have. But I also don't think I think he was about to leave the band, so we would have probably gotten that Ozzy anyway. So that's the great irony about it, his legacy would have been uncoupled from Ozzy anyway. So yeah,
he was. I mean, Ozzy said that he went into depression after the death of him, and the other people on the plane, and they canceled.
I would have been
tour.
a little bit worried about him. He might have abused some substances in the aftermath of that.
Yeah.
Had he not stopped, he might have started. But yeah, that is a crazy story, one for the ages. But such a interesting start to his solo career, and where he ends up later on with Ozfest, and kind of his legacy and kind of mythology that builds around him, and the influence, I guess, that he elder statesman of metal in some way, that he fosters later on. But yeah, good stuff. Definitely recommended. I think it's an essential album to listen to, especially in terms of like the context of history of metal, like you said, John, and kind of this era of evolution from Black Sabbath to 80s hard rock and metal.
For sure.